Hello, my friends, and welcome to She Rose Wisdom. Take a slow breath, settle in, and stay with me, because today I want to take you into a story that may completely change the way you think about human potential. But before we begin, make yourself one promise. Don't leave before the water pump, because that is the moment everything changes. You probably know Helen Keller's story, but you may not know the moment that actually changed her entire world. And if you stay with me until the end, you may discover that this story isn't only about Helen. It might also explain something about your own life. Imagine being 6 years old, having spent most of your life unable to see or hear the world around you. You cannot see your mother's face. You cannot hear her voice. You cannot ask a question. You cannot explain that you're hungry, scared, angry, or confused. You have thoughts inside your mind, but no language to release them. No words, no sentences, no way out. Now imagine everyone around you loving you deeply, but not knowing how to reach you. That's where Helen Keller's story begins, not as an inspirational quote, not as a famous name in a history book, but as a frightened, furious little girl trapped behind a wall nobody seemed able to break. Helen Keller was not a helpless child. She was intelligent, curious, and deeply eager to understand the world. But without language, her thoughts remained trapped inside her. And if you think frustration is bad when you can speak, imagine what happens when you can't speak, hear, or see at all. Helen was born on June 27, 1880, in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Her father, Arthur Keller, was a newspaper editor and former Army captain, and her mother, Kate, was loving and intelligent. Helen began life like any other healthy child. She smiled, she walked early, she even spoke a few words. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Then, at just 19 months old, something happened that changed the course of her entire life. Seriously, Helen was struck by a severe illness and dangerously high fever. Doctors of the time called it brain fever, though the exact illness was never definitively known. Her parents feared she would die. She survived, but the illness left her unable to see or hear. Think about that. Not darkness for an hour, not silence for a day. Imagine never opening your eyes and seeing your mother's face again. Imagine never hearing another human voice. Helen was still alive, but the normal bridge between her mind and everyone around her had disappeared. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. As Helen grew older, her intelligence had nowhere to go. She developed simple gestures to communicate basic needs, but she could not explain her thoughts, fears, or questions. Frustration burst outward. She screamed, resisted, and sometimes acted violently toward those around her. Her family loved her deeply, but their pity was quietly becoming a cage. And here's a lesson that still matters. Sometimes the thing we think is protecting someone can also be the thing holding them back. Helen's relatives began suggesting that she might have to be sent away to an institution. Her parents refused. They knew something had to change, but they had no idea what to do. Then Kate Keller discovered a story that gave her a tiny spark of hope. She learned about Laura Bridgman, a deaf-blind girl who had been taught to communicate at the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston. If one child had learned, perhaps Helen could too. The Kellers eventually met Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, who had spent much of his life working with deaf people. Bell recognized something important in Helen. He saw potential where others saw limitation. He directed the family toward the Perkins Institute, and then, in March 1887, a young woman named Anne Sullivan arrived at the Keller home. Helen was 6. Anne Sullivan was only 20 years old, but she carried a lifetime of hardship and determination. But Anne wasn't walking into an easy teaching job. She was walking into a battle. and she knew something Helen's family had not yet understood. Helen didn't need more pity. She needed a way to understand the world. Anne herself knew what darkness felt like. She had grown up in poverty, had lost family members, and struggled with severe vision problems before operations partially restored her sight. She knew pain, she knew isolation, and, perhaps most importantly, she knew what it meant to fight your way out of both. From the beginning, Anne challenged Helen. She demanded that she sit at the table. She insisted she use a spoon. She taught her to behave in ways Helen had never been required to behave before. Helen fought back fiercely. She screamed, she resisted, she struck Anne. Most people would have backed off. Anne didn't. And that stubbornness mattered. Because sometimes the person who changes your life isn't the person who makes everything easier. Sometimes it's the person who refuses to let you remain trapped. Anne began spelling words into Helen's hand using the manual alphabet. When Helen touched a doll, Anne spelled DOLL. When she touched food, Anne spelled its name again and again and again. But Helen didn't understand. To her, these movements were simply patterns. They had no meaning. The letters weren't connected to the objects. She could imitate the motions without understanding the idea behind them. For weeks, Anne kept going. And this is where you need to pay attention, because the greatest breakthroughs in life often look like failure right before they happen. Day after day, Helen still didn't understand. Anne wondered whether she was getting through, but she kept trying. And after weeks of effort, frustration, and small victories, the moment Anne had been fighting for was finally approaching. The water pump was waiting. Then came April 5th, 1887. A seemingly ordinary morning. A water pump. A cup. Cool water flowing over Helen's hand, and a word being spelled into her other hand. W-A-T-E-R. Again. W-A-T-E-R. And then everything stopped. Helen suddenly became still. Something clicked. The water flowing across her skin had a name. The letters Anne was pressing into her hand were not meaningless movements. They represented something real. Water. That was the breakthrough. But here's what makes it extraordinary. Helen didn't just learn one word. She suddenly understood that everything around her could be connected to language. The ground had a name. The pump had a name. The tree had a name. People had names. Objects had names. Feelings could eventually have names. Ideas could have names. Suddenly, the world wasn't just a collection of sensations. It was a world that could be understood. Helen began touching everything around her and demanding its name. She was hungry for language. By nightfall, Helen had learned nearly 30 words, and her hunger for knowledge had only begun. Think about what just happened. For years, Helen had been trapped in a world she could not explain. Then one concept opened the door. Things can have names. One word didn't magically fix her life. It gave her something much more powerful, the ability to keep learning. And once that door opened, Helen never stopped. She learned to read through raised type and braille. She learned to write. She learned to communicate complex thoughts. And then she attempted something that sounds almost impossible. She learned to speak. Remember, Helen had never heard a human voice. She couldn't hear herself. She had to learn speech through touch, feeling the movement of Anne's lips and the vibrations in her throat and attempting to reproduce them. It was difficult. Her speech was never perfectly clear, but she refused to accept silence as the final answer.
In 1900, Helen entered Radcliffe College, then Harvard's Women's College. Annie Sullivan sat beside her and spelled lectures into her hand, hour after hour, class after class. In 1904, at just 24 years old, Helen graduated, becoming the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. And this is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. The little girl once considered impossible to educate was about to change the lives of millions. But Helen didn't stop there. She became an author, writing books and essays that would eventually reach readers around the world. Her autobiography, The Story of My Life, became internationally known. She traveled across countries, she met presidents, she spoke publicly, she advocated for people with disabilities, she supported women's suffrage, she spoke about poverty and injustice. She became one of the most recognizable advocates of her generation. But there's something even more powerful hiding underneath all those accomplishments. Helen's greatest victory wasn't becoming famous, it wasn't meeting presidents, it wasn't receiving awards, it wasn't even graduating from college. Her greatest victory was that she learned how to connect her mind to the world. She went from having thoughts trapped inside her to expressing those thoughts to millions of people. And Annie Sullivan stayed beside her for decades. For nearly half a century, teacher and student remained together. Helen once described Annie as the person who had given her the world.
And that might be the most beautiful part of this entire story. Because Helen's life wasn't transformed by one magical word alone. It was transformed because one person refused to stop teaching her what that word meant. That's the distinction we often miss. A breakthrough can happen in a moment, but becoming the person who can live differently after that breakthrough takes years. Helen Keller eventually received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of America's highest civilian honors. She lived through 2 world wars and watched the world transform in ways that would have seemed unimaginable when she was a child. She died in 1968 at the age of 87, having spent her life challenging the assumptions people had made about what she could never do. Her ashes were placed beside those of Anne Sullivan Macy and Polly Thompson at Washington National Cathedral, bringing together the people who had shared so much of her life's journey. And now, I want you to think about something personal. Because maybe you've been looking at this story the wrong way. Maybe the lesson isn't simply Helen Keller overcame blindness and deafness. That's true, but it's not the deepest lesson. Maybe you've had your own version of feeling lost, a season when nothing made sense, when you couldn't understand what you were experiencing, or when you believed there was no way forward. And then one day, something clicked. A conversation, a book, a lesson, or a person helped you see things differently. That is why Helen's story still matters. Because sometimes one realization is enough to change the direction of a life. And once something has a name, you can begin to understand it. Once you understand it, you can begin to change it. That's why Helen's water pump moment still matters more than a century later. It wasn't just about water, it was about meaning. It was the moment a locked mind discovered a door. And here's the part I really want you to remember. Your breakthrough may not arrive with fireworks. It may arrive as one tiny realization that suddenly makes everything you've been experiencing make sense. So don't underestimate small moments. Don't underestimate one word. Don't underestimate one teacher. Don't underestimate the part of you that is still trying. Because the person who feels completely stuck today may be standing one realization away from a completely different life. Helen Keller once wrote that the most beautiful things in the world cannot simply be seen or touched, they must be felt.
And perhaps that's why her story still reaches people who can see, hear, speak, and read every word on this screen. She reminds us that human potential is often much larger than the circumstances surrounding it. The world may close one door. It may take away something you thought you needed. It may leave you confused, frustrated, or afraid. But that does not automatically mean your story is over.
So don't underestimate small moments. Don't underestimate one word. Don't underestimate one teacher. Don't underestimate the part of you that is still trying. Because the person who feels completely stuck today may be standing one realization away from a completely different life. Helen Keller once wrote that the most beautiful things in the world cannot simply be seen or touched, they must be felt. And perhaps that's why her story still reaches people who can see, hear, speak, and read every word on this screen. She reminds us that human potential is often much larger than the circumstances surrounding it. The world may close one door. It may take away something you thought you needed. It may leave you confused, frustrated, or afraid. But that does not automatically mean your story is over. Sometimes, my friend, it means you're still waiting for your water pump moment. So keep learning, keep asking questions, keep searching for meaning, keep reaching for the next word, because you never know which tiny piece of understanding might crack open the wall you've been staring at for years. And if Helen Keller could go from a child trapped in darkness and silence to a woman whose ideas reached millions, then maybe we should be a little more careful about saying, "I can't." Maybe the better question is, what haven't I discovered yet? Now I want to hear from you. What was your own water moment? The moment when something suddenly made sense and changed the way you saw your life? Tell me in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that go beyond what happened and uncover the deeper lessons hidden inside history, subscribe to She Rose Wisdom. Because here, we don't just remember remarkable people, we search for the wisdom their lives still offer us today. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep learning, keep questioning what you think is impossible, and never forget, sometimes one small realization is enough to open a door you thought would stay locked forever.